Hello again, class. Craig here. I wanted to go over the fallacies reading from Everything's an Argument with Readings. And you'll notice we broke this down into two parts. So the fallacies that we'll be covering for class 17 start on page 71, and I've opened a web page for each one. So as you read along, if you have your book or if you're just viewing and listening, I'll provide examples for each one as well and try to relate them as best I can to the SA2 topic, because when people stereotype, it's illogical, and it's usually a result of one or more fallacies. When people discriminate, when people are biased, it's illogical, right? So again, discrimination, stereotypes, these types of biases, they're illogical, and they're usually rooted in fallacious argument. So a fallacy is a mistaken belief, especially one based on an unsound argument. There's no logical reasons to support it. A failure in reasoning which renders an argument invalid, faulty reasoning, misleading, or unsound judgment. And the definition here, I just Googled the word. A fallacy is the use of invalid or otherwise faulty reasoning or wrong moves in the construction of an argument. Fallacious argument may be deceptive by appearing to be better than it really is. Now, I'm not going to get too crazy with this, but for those of you that are watching political debates and paying attention to these arguments, fallacies and politics. 25 logical fallacies politicians use more than you realize. Logical fallacies in politics and beyond. Again, we don't need to get into specific politicians right now for the purpose of this video reading review. However, with the election right around the corner and many of you are watching the debates, keep these ideas in mind, and when we finish our readings of the fallacies, we can come back to this, this notion. So, first off, we have our definition of a fallacy. So, our first one in the book, right? And our book's definition of fallacy is arguments that are flawed by their very nature or structure. Okay, so what are they basing their reasoning on besides logos? Well, an appeal to fear tries to scare you into making a decision instead of giving you logical reasons. Now, a lot of times with these fallacies, no logical reasons will be given because there aren't any. Or, right, the reader, the writer, the arguer, the person who's making the fallacy feels as though scaring you into making a decision, right, is going to work. Because again, it's an unsound or invalid argument, right? So when people try to scare you into making a decision, and fear is the basis, right, instead of logos, that's a fallacy. When fear not based on evidence or reason is being used as the primary motivator to get others to accept an idea, proposition, or conclusion. If you don't accept it, something terrible will happen to you. We don't bail out the big automakers, the economy will collapse. Therefore, we need to bail out the automakers. Again, notice these appeals to fear that you'll burn in hell forever. Again, politics and religion, we got to be careful with. So let's move on to the next one. False dilemma. I notice a lot of times when I click on these, logically fallacious was one of the better examples. I tried to mix it up so it's not always the same website. But you too can go to these. If you Google logical fallacies, there's quite a few reputable websites that come up, but I particularly like logicallyfallacious.com. Okay, next one, right? Either or. So it's either one or the other, but they only give you two choices. That's why this is called the false dilemma fallacy. Instead of presenting all of the options, they only present two. and one of them stinks. So they try to scare you into choosing the second option because the possibility of the other one is scary in some ways. So a lot of times either or is kind of a combination, right? By presenting that false dilemma, a lot of times there's also scare tactics as well. You're either for the war or against the troops. Again, you could be against the war but pro-troops. You know, when people say you're either against burning the flag or you're not patriotic. Well, being patriotic means you love your country. You can love your country and you can also just look at the flag, right, as a symbol, not necessarily something that, you know, if you aren't against it, then you can't love your country, right? Parents do this all the time, right? Either eat your broccoli or you won't get dessert. Why don't they give other nutritional options? Why does it have to be just broccoli, right? So again, it's when other options are not presented. I stand against going to war. Since you are against war, you must be against our troops, right? Again, they kind of show a presidential debate, right? Against our troops, is she really? Right, so again, you could see how these ideas are fallacious, right? As the book says, because such tactics can make productive, principled argument more difficult, they potentially hurt everyone involved, including the people responsible for that. So again, we see how instead of logos, right, substituting two and only two options instead of giving all of them, using fear instead of logic. The next one, right, in our book, so either or is also called a false dilemma. The next one's a slippery slope. And this one is a combination of either or and scare tactics, because it's essentially saying if this either, right, this happens or this will happen, right? Here's the example. When someone makes a claim about a series of events that lead to one major event, usually a bad. In this fallacy, a person makes a claim that one event leads to another. And so until we come to some awful conclusion, right, along the way, each step or event in the faulty logic becomes more and more improbable. If we enact any kind of gun control laws, the next thing you know, we won't be allowed to have any guns at all. When that happens, we won't be able to defend ourselves against terrorist attacks. And when that happens, terrorists will take over our country. Therefore, gun control laws will cause us to lose our country to terrorists. I think we can all see the error in reasoning there. Again, I hate to keep coming back to it, but a lot of times presidential or political candidates will use the slippery slope to scare people in some ways into making or not making a decision because of an exaggeration of possible consequences. And again, we see another example on Excelsior Online Writing Lab. As we move on, the next one is overly sentimental appeals. Now, just as someone might use fear to persuade you instead of logos, here they might try to use too much emotion. I can't help but think of those television commercials for animals in the pound that just kind of overdo it, and you might just turn away because it's just too much. Usually there's a Sarah McLachlan song playing in the background. Emotion in place of reason in order to win the argument. It's a type of manipulation used in place of valid logic. Again, so power lines cause cancer. I met a little boy with cancer who lived just 20 miles from a power line. He looked into my eyes and said in his weak voice, please do whatever you can so other kids won't have to go through what I'm going through. I urge you to vote for this bill to tear down all power lines and replace them with monkeys on treadmills. Again, but that has nothing to do with the assertion or the conclusion. We can all tear up over the image of a little boy with cancer who's expressing concern rather than taking pity on himself, but that has nothing to do with the assertion or conclusion. So again, excessive emotions instead of logic. On to the next one. Appeal to false authority. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped bandwagon. Bandwagon appeals on page 75. Peer pressure is a perfect example of this, right? If everyone's going to get the new smartphone when it comes out this weekend, why aren't you? Right? Hello, money. Wait, she just said she doesn't have the money. Oh, but you should get it, right? And you could kind of continue reading on here the example. But again, just not, rather than logic, doing it because everybody else is. And that in some ways establishes everybody else as a false authority, which brings us to our next fallacy, false authority. When people rely on the wrong experts as an authoritative figure whose authority is invalid because they either have dubious credentials, irrelevant credentials, or no credentials at all. That's why I had you read Kathy Freston's My Story, right? The document from her website about who she is and her credentials, because that helped you evaluate her ethos and whether or not you felt that she was an effective authority to make the claim about diet choices and the environment. I also had you read About Us from the Huffington Post, where vegetarianism new Prius appeared, so that you could come to some understanding as to whether or not you felt the Huffington Post is a credible source of information, right? A proper authority. An appeal to false authority is an argument that states that we should listen to the opinion of a false authority figure who is framed as credible authority on the topic being discussed. Whenever you see famous people advertising for something or trying to market a product, you have to ask yourself, are they an authority? I mean, you look at somebody like Michael Jordan, right? Obviously, he's an authority on basketball sneakers, but, you know, is he an authority on what breakfast cereal you should eat or what kind of undershirts you should wear, right? I know he's for Wheaties and Hanes. Again, especially when being persuaded, people are trying to persuade you as to who you should vote for, right? What choices you should make with regard to politics. Ask yourself, are they an authority on the subject? And again, I think a lot of these fallacies and understanding them are present, right? In our cultures and in life, and especially in stereotypes and discrimination, because again, there's no logos to support it. So that brings us to our last fallacy, and this one's a big one, right? Dogmatism. Basically, it's when people say, I'm right and everybody else is wrong, and there's no possibility that anybody else has, right, any sort of logical, incontrovertibly true, any sort of logical contention with me. When something's dogmatic, right? Dogma, the broad sense that any belief held unquestioningly and with undefended certainty, maybe in the form of official system of principles, doctrines of religion, positions of a philosopher. Again, when we see political figures, people in positions of power that do not, I mean, the opposite of dogmatism is Rogerian argument, empathy, that idea of let's meet in the middle, let's find a mutually beneficial solution, that idea of concession that we've been talking about when we read about Rogerian argument and Toulmin argument in the book, making concessions, right? Recognizing the merits of the counter argument. Dogmatism's the opposite, right? And either people don't have a logical reason or they don't want to say what the reason is. Two very, very popular ideas that support this idea of dogmatism, right? They either don't have the reasons, right? Or their reasons are they don't know what the reasons are to persuade you, or their reasons are biased. And again, stereotypes, discrimination, perfect examples of dogmatism, the opposite of Rogerian argument, which was one of the first bold-faced words we came across in this book. And as you know, I'm constantly reminding about the power of empathy and the importance of Rogerian argument when constructing your academic argument essays and carefully structuring your research. Remember, when you integrate student learning outcome, your sources and your quotes, you want to look at them from a Rogerian perspective. You want to offer concessions so you appear fair before engaging in refutation of the counter argument. So I hope this was helpful. More to come. We'll pick up on page 78 next time. Thanks for listening. And as always, get in touch if you have any questions.